Yo, what's going on, snipers, and welcome to my Minnesota Wild finale recap. So I played out the last of the GM modes, the last, I think it was 10 years or so, and then I also basically recorded still player stats and all that stuff. So I'm going to tell you guys all the player stats from this GM mode that I know of, not all the original guys, but a lot of the big players that we had on our team, and then the guys that were there like in the final season and whatnot, so you guys could expect what the team would look like going into the future. And then also I'm going to do a quick recap on each season so you guys could find out how we did, like did we win the Stanley Cup, did we win President's Trophies, how did we do offensively, all that sort of stuff. So let's get into it. Okay, so starting off with the 2033 off season, that's where we stopped because we did up till the end of the 2032-33 season. So we basically were just eliminated by the St. Louis Blues in the last episode. So this is basically where it starts off. So basically at the draft we would have the 19th overall pick, and we would select power forward, medium elite, 71 overall, Bobby McCormick. So yeah, we drafted that Bobby McCormick guy that I was showing you guys at the end, I think, of last episode. To make even things more interesting, we would draft his brother Roger McCormick in the 3rd round. Yeah, there was 2 McCormicks. It was kind of weird because Bobby was playing in the WHL and Roger was playing in the Swiss League, so we're just going to say they're brothers. Unfortunately, Roger would never make the NHL, but he would stay in the AHL for his entire career, or well, till the end of the GM mode series. The re-sign stage would come around, and we would have to part ways actually with a longtime member of the Minnesota Wild, and that was Larry Souray. He didn't want to re-sign with us, and he wanted $9 million, and that was for an 84 overall, so we decided to let him go. As well, we let go of Tommy Kilger and Kai Yolonen, as we needed more money for our RFAs, because our RFAs were younger and we just wanted to be a young team and a competitive team. So we had to make room for Clinton Martin, so we basically traded away Marshall Tillett. Marshall Tillett was getting angry with his ice time a lot, and he was just being like a little bit of a locker room cancer, you could say. So we traded him with a 6th round pick to the Boston Bruins for just a 1st round pick. So we were trying to see if we could get maybe a nice hot top pick with that pick, but that didn't end up. And then we did not sign any free agents in the off season, as we had a lot of young players that were growing and getting ready for the NHL. Larry Souray would sign for 3 years at $9.3 million with the Nashville Predators. So he would sign with Nashville, the team that took us out like 2 seasons ago. Now into the 2033-34 season, Yanni Natnan, who was a 2nd round pick of ours, I don't remember what year it was, he made the NHL for the first time as an 81 overall, so he was a pretty solid piece to come into the NHL. As well, Edward Ferguson and Francois Cormier made the teams as depth guys with 4th line roles. So those guys, eventually they would both leave the team because we didn't really have the room for them, and we would rather play our good prospects. Those guys were getting older. As well, Kirill Kaprizov dropped to an 81 overall, and his potential became an exact bottom 6 forward at the age of 36. So he was dropping off, but did he retire? You guys will find out when he retires. It's pretty crazy. So now into the season. Our preseason was a pretty good record. We went 3-1-2, and then to start the season we were actually pretty good, going 7-3-1 in the first month of October. This would continue into November, where we went 9-2-1, and then December was kind of our okay month. We went 9-5, and then January came around and we were playing great again, going 9-2-1. By the deadline we would have a crazy good record of 41-17-4. During March, Andrew Urkamps would battle with injuries, so yeah, he basically was battling with injuries for a bit. In this result, that was the worst month of the season for us, as we would go 8-5-3. Obviously that was the case with our top line left wing battling injuries. The 4 games in April brought 3 more wins though, and we would finish 52-23-7 for the 2nd best team in the league, behind the young and talented Philadelphia Flyers. Our goals for were 241 goals, goals against 188, so we played really good defensively as well. Our power play percentage was clicking at 22%, and our penalty kill was an 83.7%. Our team lead in goals was Kirill Kaprizov of 28, so he had a bit of an off year for goal scoring, but he still led the team. Our assist leader was Eric Fitzgerald with 45. Our point leader was Eric Fitzgerald with 69, and then our plus minus leader was Bear Schultz with a plus 31. He also led in penalty minutes with 96. Our goalie stats, Hellenis was pretty good that year. He went 36, 14, and 5 with a 2.19 goals against average and a 926 save percentage in 7 shutouts. While our backup Manny McQuaid played solid as well, going 16, 9, and 2 with a 2.37 goals against average, a 923 save percentage, and 3 shutouts. The Minnesota Wild would have to take on the Nashville Predators in Larry Suet in round 1. So just the year after they released him, they have to meet up with him in the first round. Game 1 was a very close one, but it would end in a 2-1 loss, as the Wild's only goal came from Kirill Kaprizov. Game 2 was a horrible game for the Wild, as they would allow 6 goals on only 23 shots and fall by a score of 6-2. The first line was the only line able to convert for the team. Game 3 back in Nashville, the Wild were looking to get back in the series. They would make some changes prior to the game. Wild would come out fine in the first period, outshooting the Preds by a score of 14-6. Minnesota would continue to slaughter into the second and third period, or in the second period, but they'd go down into the third by 1 goal. They were outshooting the Preds 27-15 and needed a win. Nashville would score 2 more goals though in the third period, going up 3-0, but then youngster Natanen would at least get 1 goal on the board for the Wild, but they would still lose 3-1, or 4-1 actually, because there was an empty net or 2. So basically the Wild were in a 3-0 series hole. Game 4, to shake things up, we went best lines to see if he could pull out a miracle. As well, goalie Manny McQuaid was put in between the pipes. Minnesota would strike first as Eric Fitzgerald got them on the board, followed by Bear Schultz to make it a 2-0 lead after the first period. The second period began, and fourth liner Reginald McKelly would make it 3-0, but Nashville would answer shorthanded to make it 3-1 going into the final period. Lawson would score a huge goal early to make it a 4-1 lead for Minnesota. Monroe answered back for Nashville, and Thomas would score late, but the Wild held on to a 4-3 win heading back home. Game 5 back in front of their home crowd, the Wild still needed the win again, and the legend Kirill Kaprizov would strike first in possibly his last NHL game. Kaprizov would then pick up his second goal early in the second period to make it a 2-0 lead going into the third. Youngster Natanen would pick up an insurance marker, followed by Fitzgerald to make it a commanding 4-0 lead, and once again the Wild would force another game. Game 6, the hardest game of the season. Game 6 back in Nashville, Wild needing to apply pressure on the Preds. First liner Andrew Urquhart broke the ice, which would give the Wild a 1-0 lead after the first period. Eric Fitzgerald would score early into period 2 to make it 2-0 after 2 periods. Wild were being outshot, but they needed to lock in the game in period 3, which they did just that as they rallied back from an 0-3 series lead for the Predators to force a Game 7 back on home ice. Hellenis picking up back-to-back shutouts in the process. Game 7, with everything trending in the way of the Wild, they just needed to push a tiny bit harder. 1 more win and they would do the improbable. Nashville would strike first and the lead after 1. They had a long power play, so they outshot the Wild 12-6 after 20 minutes. Veteran Bruce Richmond scored a big goal early in the second period to tie the game up. Jared Malone would score to make it 2-1, but Nashville's franchise center would tie it up going to 2-2 going into the third period. Nashville would power home 2 goals in the third period and would oust the Wild 4-2 in the 7-game series. Wild were happy with how they played at the end of the series, but it just was not enough to get on to the next round. That was their 3rd straight season getting eliminated in the first round. The Cup finals that year end up being the Buffalo Sabres, led by former goalie prospect Samuel Salo. I think I told you guys in the last episode he grew to a 91 and it was a high elite. He led them to the Stanley Cup finals, and he was playing against St. Louis, who had Bear Schultz's brother Ronald, as well as former draft pick Gene Seabrook was there. St. Louis would win the series in 7 games and win, I think it was their first Stanley Cup of the GM mode. When it came to the retirement screen, nobody retired from the Minnesota Wild, and nobody that used to play for us retired either. So it was not that bad of a year. We thought we were going to lose Kaprizov and maybe Ruchin, but we did not lose them, so it was all good. Now onto more stuff from the offseason. The top pick in this draft was Ace Stepan to the Los Angeles Kings. He was a franchise center. And then in terms of resign stage, we would have to release Mikhail Mayorov so we can make room for defenseman Franklin Kuiper, who was coming up. He was one of those unsigned or undrafted unsigned prospects that we decided to pick up, as well as third liner Nicholas Gustafson was released to make room for Dwayne Carter, who was another one of those undrafted low elites. To wrap it up, the Minnesota Wild would also release big piece in Andrew Urkamps. And Andrew Urkamps, like I was saying, he was like a 92, but we had to let him go because he wanted $12.85 million for 7 years at age 32. It was just way too much to get for him. And besides, we had so much young prospects that I didn't want to really screw up the cap situation because he was the main reason we were in cap problems to begin with. So we let him go. He would eventually go on, though, to sign a 6-year, $12.275 million contract with the Boston Bruins, who we beat in the Stanley Cup Finals however many years ago. In terms of free agent signings, we didn't have a single free agent signing, but we did make one trade that kind of raised some people's eyebrows, and that was we acquired back Larry Souray from the Nashville Predators, as Nashville offered him to us for our first and third in the 2035 draft. So we did that just because we wanted to bring him back, even though I wanted to kind of bring him back the season beforehand, but obviously I didn't want to give him his money. But since he was already on a 2-year contract, I decided to just bring him in for 1 season at least, and then we could flip him again. 2034-35 season simulation. The team was looking really good on paper, as there's no player below at 78. As well, medium elite goaltending prospect Ernest Krause would grow to a 74 and be the AHL starter that season. October was a bit of a slow start for the Minnesota Wild, as they would go 4-6-2. However, they would bounce back in November, going 8-4-1. Helenius would miss 1 game during the month with an injury. Already at this point, Kirill Kaprizov would have 17 points in 25 games at age 36-37. December started abruptly, as Helenius would go down with another injury, but this time till the end of the month. In response, youngster Ernest Krause would have to be called up till the end of the month. In his first ever NHL game he played against the Carolina Hurricanes, he pulled out a 28-save shutout. Everybody knew that Krause was going to be ready for the NHL come next season. Despite Helenius' injury, the Wild still went 8-4-0 in December. January got even better, as they would go 7-3-1, and then slightly worse in February, going 8-4-1. March was a busy month, but they would also play really well, going 11-4-1 to clinch a playoff spot. As well as on March 3rd, Kirill Kaprizov would pick up 2 points to reach 1,000 points in his career versus the San Jose Sharks. It was the first ever Minnesota player to ever do so in franchise history. The 3 games in April would not go so well for the Wild, as they would go 0-2-1 and finish the season 46-29-7. They'd have 233 goals for, 195 goals against, a power play of 20.7%, and a really good penalty kill of 85.8. The team leader in goals was once again Kirill Kaprizov, but this time Kaprizov had a really good goal scoring season, as he would put up 40 goals. The assist leader was Eric Fitzgerald with 50 assists, and the point leader was also Fitzgerald with 78. Plus minus leader was Kirill Kaprizov, as he was a plus 35. And then Ryan Dundas would lead the team in penalty minutes with 129. Round 1 would see a familiar foe in the St. Louis Blues. Game 1 was a bit of a close one, but the Blues would prevail and would take it 2-1. Game 2 was a good game for the first 3 periods, until the final 5 minutes, when St. Louis would tie the game up, and then they would win it in overtime. The Wild would bounce back in Game 3, putting up 4 goals and shutting out the Blues by a score of 4-0. Game 4 was another critical game, as if they would lost this, they would go down 3-1, which is not what they wanted. But the Wild produced, and they defended really well, as they would win the game 5-1 and tie the series going back to St. Louis. Game 5 wouldn't work in the Wild's favor, as they would drop the game 4-2, and they would be down by 1 in the series. Basically, the St. Louis Blues were a really good home ice team in this playoff, so it was very tough for the Wild in St. Louis. Game 6 was back in Minnesota, and the veteran Kirill Kaprizov would put up the eventual game-winning goal in the 3rd period, and it would be a 3-2 win for the Wild, and force another Game 7. Game 7 was back in St. Louis, and once again the Blues would play amazing in their home rink, shutting the door on the Wild on their season and in the game by a score of 2-0. So we would lose in 7 games, just like we did the year before. The Cup champions would eventually be the New York Islanders for the first time in GM mode, as they beat out the San Jose Sharks. Despite getting up there in age, Minnesota would not lose a single player to retirement. However, a couple ex-players would retire. So first would be the first ever draft pick we had in this GM mode, and that was Isaac Lundestrom, who was drafted 10th overall at the 2018 draft. He would be an ultimate bust, playing only 263 NHL games and putting up 61 points in the process. Second would be depth defender Magnus Jacobs, who was a great depth defender for the Wild in their cup win versus the Bruins. He would only play 134 NHL games but put up 16 points, probably most of those with us. Well, the last one was probably the most notorious bust of the series, and that was former medium elite goaltender Nicholas Whiting. He never reached his medium elite potential, as his highest overall, I think I saw him at, was an 80. He played 78 games in his career only, going 27, 36, and 5, and he had a 900 save percentage and a 3.14 goals against average. He did get one shutout in his career, but he just was not a good goaltender by any means. In terms of the offseason, at the draft, the Minnesota Wild would trade away Larry Souray, who they acquired again the year before. They got rid of him just because they got an offer from the Colorado Avalanche that they felt they could not refuse, as they picked up a medium top 4 defensive prospect in Reitz. As well, they got a 3rd round pick out of it. During the re-signing stage, the Wild would release Tuomas Helenius to make room for Ernest Krause. So we got rid of Helenius, the guy that we traded for from Corson, and we put in Krause for the following season. This would back up Manny McQuaid for the following season, as McQuaid would become a starter for the first time in his career. Helenius would go on to sign with the Montreal Canadiens, and once again, no free agent signings were needed to make for the Wild, as they already had a ton of good prospects. 2035-36 season simulation. The season started off horribly for the Wild, as they'd go 17-20-2 by January 1st. They would improve greatly by the deadline, going 17-5-1 over that span. By the end of the season, their record was just barely enough to get them in the postseason, as they finished 44-33-5. Kirill Kaprizov would show no hope of slowing down, as he'd put up 72 points, 82 games, only 4 points behind Eric Fitzgerald for the team lead. Round 1 would see the St. Louis Blues once again, so once again it was the matchup between the Schultz brothers. The Wild would take game 1 4-2, as they were trailing 2-0 going into the third period, but they would score 4 goals in the third period to help them win. Game 2 would be a good defensive game for both teams, but the Blues would prevail and shut out the Wild 2-0 to tie the series. Game 3 was a big offensive game for both teams, but the Wild would come out in overtime, as they would win by a final score of 5-4. Kirill Kaprizov would have a hat-trick in that game at age 38 or whatever he was by then. Game 4, the Wild had high hopes of another good game, but this one was just an overpowering in offensive talent for the St. Louis Blues, as they were smoked 7-2. Wild would not be able to find their offensive touch in game 5 and 6, losing by a score of 3-2, and would be eliminated for the first round for the 4th straight season. Despite having the season end so quickly, Kirill Kaprizov would take home the Lady Byng Trophy. The LA Kings would take home the Cup for the first time in the series with a win over the Detroit Red Wings. As well, at the draft, the Minnesota Wild would select a top 9 forward in a guy with a really cool name, Stanley Champion, just to make them feel like they won something, because it makes them sound like they were the Stanley Cup champion, because this guy, he probably has a middle name of Cup or something. Unfortunately, the prospect would never actually get to the NHL. He'd only be in the AHL, so he was a bit of a bust, but it's still a cool name. In the re-sign stage, the Wild would part ways with Philip Haas, who joined the team 8 years prior to this. He would sign with the Philadelphia Flyers for 3 years. As a response to letting Haas go, the Wild would sign former Flyers pick Serge Dupuis, who was like an 84 overall sniper. 2036-37 season simulation. After a first round exit, the Wild were determined to try and go farther this season. By January 1st, they would have a record of 23-15-3. They would stumble the rest of the season, but still make the playoffs just barely, going 42-32-8. The Wild would score 219 goals and allow 194. The power play struggled majorly, as it was only a 16.2% effective, while the penalty kill was a solid 82%. Round 1 would see the Winnipeg Jets for the first time in quite a few years. Game 1 was a good start, as the Wild would prevail in overtime by a goal from Bobby McCormick in a 3-2 win. However, the offense was nowhere to be found in Game 2, as the Wild fell 3-0 in the game and the series was tied going back to Winnipeg. The power play continued to struggle for the second straight game. The Wild couldn't solve the goaltender, and they would be shut out again by a final score of 4-0. Game 4, the Wild would find the back of the net twice, and this time they were the ones to shut out Jets, as they won by a final score of 2-0. to tie it up going back home. Game 5 was a tight game, but the Wild would come up just short as they fall 3-2 in overtime. Game 6 back in Winnipeg, back on the brink of elimination again. The offense would just fall into a stalemate for the Wild, and the Jets would convert 4 times and take the game 4-1 in a series 4-2. Once again, it was another disappointing season for the Minnesota Wild. The Jets would move on to the Cup Finals only to lose to the Ottawa Senators. With players Bruce Rugin and Kirill Kaprizov getting old, the GM thought that they would lose him to the retirement. However, nobody was lost to retirement for the Wild, so once again Kirill Kaprizov coming back for another season, closer to his 40s by now. However, former draft pick Vladislav Gonchar retired as a member of the Vancouver Canucks. Most of his points actually came with the Canucks because the Canucks were good for quite a few years. His final stats were 743 games played, 111 goals, 148 assists for 259 points. At the draft, the Wild would select another medium elite goaltender just to have a couple extras just in case Krause didn't pan out, and that guy was Stanley Gibbons. At the re-sign stage, the Wild would part ways with Johnny Lawson to make room for prospects, and they would also lose long-term attendee Manny McQuaid, because Manny McQuaid, he grew to an 89 because of statistical growth, and he wanted $9.5 million for the next 8 years, which I was nowhere near wanting to give him, so we let him go. So our goaltending tandem was completely different for the upcoming season. In response to letting him go, we picked up Kenny Wisniewski, who's an 82 overall goalie, just for our backup because Krause was going to be our starter. So that's what we did in terms of free agency. 2037-38 season simulation. At January 1st, things weren't going the way for the Minnesota Wild. So in an attempt to shake things up, they would find out that Darcy Corson was actually still a free agent at 88 overall. So they would offer him just a 1-year deal at $3.5 million and sign their old starter. Since it meant they would have 3 goaltenders, they decided just to put their backup, who they signed in free agency, Wisniewski, on waivers at an 82 overall. He'd easily be claimed by another team. Corson would go on to play 35 games in the remaining half of the season, going 15-15-4 with a .906 save percentage and a 2.7 goals against average. Obviously not as good as his early years, but still respectable for his age. The Wild would fail to make the playoffs for the first time in over 10 years. They finished with a record of 33, 40, and 9, scoring just 216 goals and allowing way more than they usually do, which was 230 goals against. They also had a ridiculously bad power play that went 10.2%, and their penalty kill was solid at an 82.5. The Arizona Coyotes would go on to win the Stanley Cup against the Carolina Hurricanes. For the first time in his career, Bear Schultz would also take home the Selke Trophy, in between his brother winning the Selke Trophy a couple times. When the retirements rolled out at the end of the season, the Wild would lose their all-time great player, Kirill Kaprizov, at age 41. He was the second best in his retirement class. His stats include 1,594 games played, 626 goals, 558 assists for 1,184 points. He finished just behind Vegas's Brian Street, who finished with 1,230 points in 1,522 games. Some former players retired, such as Tommy Kilger, who had 150 goals, 136 assists for 286 points in 906 games, while former first-round pick Gene Seabrook retired with 18 points in 324 games. At the draft, the Wild would pick up right-wing power forward Marty Festerling at an 80 overall. At the re-sign stage, the Wild would release Franklin Kuiper and Dwayne Carter. As well, they released Darcy Corson because he dropped to a 79 due to his age and would be listed as a fringe starter goaltender. He would remain a free agent for the rest of his career. They would also lose defenseman Ryan Dundas to the New York Rangers, as he rejected offers up to $5 million more than his asking point. To replace Ryan Dundas, the Wild would sign 86 overall defenseman Chad Ray. He was a former first-round draft pick, I think he went 5th or 6th overall one year. The Wild would also sign former medium elite draft pick Harvey Pittis as the team's new backup behind Ernest Krause at an 83 overall. He spent his previous years with the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Calgary Flames, and I think a couple other teams. 2038-39 season simulation. Rookies Marty Festerling and Milan Pasternak would make the team's roster for the upcoming season. The Wild would struggle to make the playoffs again this season, going 40, 37, and 5. So they improved from the year before, but still not good enough to make the playoffs. However, Eric Fitzgerald still played great as he led the team with 78 points. The main problem was the team's defensive play, as they allowed 242 goals against and had a penalty kill of 75.3. The Arizona Coyotes would make it back to the Stanley Cup Finals, but they would lose to the New York Islanders. The Wild would lose another big piece to retirement, and that guy was Bruce Ruchin. He would retire with 1,390 games played, 162 goals, 479 assists for 641 points. Also, former left winger Andrew Urkamps retired with the Boston Bruins. He had 1,221 points in 1,532 games. There was also a lot of ex-players, including Kent Hodges, who retired with 1,214 games played in 210 points, as well as Jared Malone, who had 164 points in 494 games. Other former players include Jaden Shipchura, who had 141 points in 364 games, Victor Schrader, who had 129 points in 1,146 games played, Chuck Knubel, who had 124 points in 1,360 games played, and one of the best goaltenders in NHL history, Darcy Corson. He played 1,000 games in his career, 508 wins, 370 losses, 97 OT losses, 92 shutouts, a 2.33 goals against average, and a .922 save percentage. At the draft, the Wild would take another medium elite goaltender in Jesper Brodin, the son of Jonas Brodin. At free agency, the Wild would trade Clinton Martin to the Ducks for a third and a fourth. The reason being is he was dropping off and getting pissed with his ice time because he was listed as a top 4 but playing on the top 6 role, and the guy actually never really put up much points. Like, he had I think 3 or 4 seasons where he never scored a single goal. In terms of free agency signings, the Wild would sign defensemen David Pacioretty and Ulf Pettersson. Before the end of the offseason, the Wild go on the trading block, go for a little hunt to see if they could find anything that could help them win a cup in the next couple seasons, because there was not that much seasons left in the GM mode. They found a huge piece on the block in St. Louis, that being 23-year-old, 86 overall medium elite goaltender Patrick Blake. To acquire him, the Wild decided to pull out one of the biggest trades in franchise history. The Wild would acquire Blake and the Blues' 2040 first-round pick. The Blues would get back Dmitriev, who was one of the unsigned medium elite goaltenders, but he was growing pretty well. They also decided to give Harvey Pittis up as part of the deal, just so they could give St. Louis back a goaltender. 2039 40 season simulation. The first season with Patrick Blake as a starter was a solid one. By the end of the regular season, the Wild would have a record of 49, 27, and 6, and that would put them 6th best in the entire league. The team scored 224 goals and only allowed 184, so it was a major improvement from the year before, where they had Corson as their starter for most of it. The power play was also pretty decent, going at a 19.2 percentage, while the penalty kill was also pretty solid at an 83%, so definitely a big upgrade from the year before. For the first time in 2 years, the Wild would make it back to the postseason. Round 1, they would take on the Los Angeles Kings for one of the first times. Game 1 was a close one, but Milan Pasternak would score a game-winning goal in the second period to deliver a 3-2 win for the Minnesota Wild. Game 2 turned out to be another close game, but the Kings would score the game-winning goal with only 3 minutes and 7 seconds left to tie the series up, headed back to Los Angeles. Game 3, the offense came out clicking for the Wild 4 times to be exact, and Patrick Blake played an amazing game, making 42 saves for a 4-0 shutout in a 2-1 series lead. However, Game 4 was another close game, 2-2 late in the third, but once again a late goal by the Kings would prevail the game-winning goal with 3:30 left on the clock. They would also add an empty netter to win the game 4-2 and tie the series up, headed back to St. Paul. Game 5 was another close game. The Wild, though, were being outshot by 9 shots and ended up losing the game by a score of 4-3. Now, they were on the brink of elimination going into LA. This didn't serve any better, as they would allow a super late tally from the Kings with 21 seconds left in the third period, and the Kings would go on to win the series in only 6 games. And once again, it was another first-round exit for the Minnesota Wild. LA would move on to the finals, where they would lose to the Ottawa Senators. In terms of retirement for the Wild, there was none. However, former player Larry Souray hanged up the skates with 575 points in 1,340 games. As for the Wild, they got super lucky, as the first round pick they had acquired from St. Louis turned out to be a lottery pick. St. Louis missed the playoffs, and that pick turned out to be a 6th overall draft choice. With that pick, they would draft Edwin Fallon as a 75 overall medium elite center playmaker. The Wild would also release one player in the free agency, and that was Ulf Pettersson, who they signed 1 year prior to this. 2040-41 season simulation. The 2040-41 season began with a thud. Captain Bear Schultz would separate his shoulder and miss action from October the 24th to January 12th. A total of 22 games to be exact. The Wild would finish still good enough to make the playoffs, as they finished with a 46-28-8 record, scoring 219 goals, allowing only 179. The power play was actually pretty good this year, going at a 22.6%, and the penalty kill was solid at an 82.2. Round 1 would see a familiar foe in the Chicago Blackhawks. Vince Lewis was pretty much the only man left from the Chicago club that we used to see in the actual simulation videos. Game 1 started off bad as the Wild would lose on home ice by a score of 3-1. Former Wild draft pick and current Blackhawk Bob Spooner had 2 of the 3 goals. Game 2 was battle of the goalies as Blake would shut out the Blackhawks 1-0 with a 25 save performance. Game 3 back in Chicago was another tightly contested game, but would end in a 2-1 loss in overtime. Bear Schultz would have the only goal for the Minnesota Wild. Game 4, the offense continued to struggle badly for the Wild as they were shut out 2-0 and back on the brink of elimination. Game 5, they needed their offense to produce. The Wild would go up 1-0, but the Hawks would answer back with a fluke goal by Minnesota's own defenseman Chad Ray, who banked it in off the back of Blake and in. The Wild would lose in overtime by a score of 2-1, and the series ended in a quick 5-game span. The Wild only scored a total of 4 times in 5 games, so their offense just did not click at the right time. The Stanley Cup Finals would roll out as the Vegas Golden Knights would take on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Vegas would take it and win their franchise's first Stanley Cup. Retirements came next, and there was none for the Wild, but 3 former players, including Mikhail Mayorov, who retired as a St. Louis Blue. His stats were 1,295 games played, 108 goals, 217 assists for 325 points. Also, former first-round pick of the Wild, Roman Brand, would retire as a free agent. Once he was released by the Wild, he never played another NHL game again. He only played a couple years in the AHL and then also just as a free agent. So you could say, I guess, that he went to the Czech Republic. Finally, former AHL starting goaltender Vic Kessel retired, playing only 3 games in the NHL but going 1-1-1 with a 2.29 goals against average and a .918 save percentage. During this final re-sign stage, the Wild would release David Pacioretty, Lou Bolt, Stanley Dubnyk, and Ross Bitts. As well, they had to part ways with Ernest Krause, who was an 87 overall goaltender at the time. The Wild just did not have enough in terms of cap space, and Krause was probably wanting more starting time, and obviously the Wild would prefer giving it to Patrick Blake, who would grow to a 91 for the final season. Also during the offseason, the Wild decided to trade away Chad Ray to free up cap space, and because they felt salty about how Ray scored on his own net in a critical game. He would be traded to the Carolina Hurricanes in exchange for backup A. Kalinin and defenseman for the top 6 in Bear Robinson. With all the cap saved up, the Wild would sign an 89 overall top 2 D-man in Harold Bales and an 81 bottom 6 forward in Burrows. 2041-42 season simulation. The final season got off to a strong start as by January 1st the Wild would have a really nice record, going 26-10-3. However, they would stumble for the next half of the season with their remaining record going 20-19-4. They would finish the season 46-29-7 and would be 5th best in goals with 220, 4th best in goals against with 177. In terms of the power play, it was clicking at a 19.1%, and the penalty kill was down from the year before at an 80.6. Round 1, the Wild would meet up with the Colorado Avalanche for the first time, I believe, in the entire GM mode. Game 1 would start off in the series in a bad way as the Wild would drop it 5-2. Game 2, they would bounce back though with a nice 4-1 win and a 38 save performance from Patrick Blake. Game 3, back in the Mile High City, Blake would play great again, making 35 saves. However, they were still a bit short in a 3-2 loss. Game 4, and the Wild needed to win once again. It was a solid defensive game. However, the Wild could not find their groove as they would drop the game in overtime by a score of 2-1. Game 5, and potentially the last game of this GM mode, the game was a very offensively based game, both teams trading chances and goals. By the end of regulation, the score would be tied 3-3, and in overtime was tightly contested until the final minutes of the first overtime period, where the Avs would get a break and win the game and the series. The Wild would end the GM mode with only 2 cup wins in their name. In good news, the first star of the game was Eric Fitzgerald, who had 1 goal, 1 assist in the loss. Him and so many others would go down in best players in Wild history. The last Stanley Cup matchup was between the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Dallas Stars. The Penguins would prevail with former player Philip Haas playing for their AHL affiliate in Wilkes-Barre Scranton. So now that you guys have a brief history of what happened over the final 10 or so seasons, let's flip on over to some all-time cup winners from the GM mode, how much cups each team won, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so the Oilers and the Senators were the most victorious teams in this GM mode, as they won 3 cups in 3 attempts. The most cup appearances though belonged to the Toronto Maple Leafs, who made it a total of 4 times, but they lost twice and they won twice. The Coyotes, the Islanders, the Hurricanes, and us would win 2 of their 3 attempts in the Stanley Cup. Other teams than that would win 1 cup, including the Canucks, the Penguins, the Blues, the Kings, the Golden Knights, Stars, Lightning, and the Blackhawks. Every other team never won a Stanley Cup. 7 teams never made a Stanley Cup Finals appearance, including the Anaheim Ducks, the Columbus Blue Jackets, the Florida Panthers, the Montreal Canadiens, the Nashville Predators, the New Jersey Devils, and finally the Washington Capitals. Okay, so now that you guys know all the cup winners, let's get into the all-time Minnesota Wild player stats. Okay guys, so now onto our recap of our player stats for their careers. So we're going to start off with a couple players you guys know and move on to the ones you guys won't know. So starting off, we have Andrew Urquhart. So this guy we acquired from the Chicago Blackhawks in free agency in 2028. During his time with us, he played 478 games, putting up 151 goals, 265 assists for 416 points. So he's a really good player for us. He played on that top line alongside of Eric Fitzgerald and Barry Schultz for 5 or 6 years before we had to actually let him go, which you guys didn't actually see. That was when I was simulating out the rest of the GM mode. So he basically signed as a free agent with the Boston Bruins, who we beat in the Cup Finals a couple years prior to this. And he was pretty good with Boston, but he was kind of declining a bit because he had like around 60-70 points a season with us. But then when he went to Boston, his first season, he put up only 59 points. The following season, he played really well, playing up 61 points in 73 games. But then he fell again for the next 3 seasons, going 59 points, 56 points, and 50 points. However, he did retire with 1,221 points in 1,532 games by the end of his career. He retired as a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, which he won both those with us. He did not win any with Chicago or any with Boston. And he actually won the Calder as the Rookie of the Year back in, I think it was the 2019 season, 2020 season. It was somewhere around there, maybe when we went to the Cup Finals for the first time against the Toronto Maple Leafs. But yeah, this guy was a really good player. Definitely a very good first overall pick in my book. Next up, we have everybody's favorite captain, and that is Barry Schultz. He was a captain for, I think, probably around 16-17 years. Because I think one of his first seasons that he came into the NHL, he became a captain. So anyways, with us, he was just like the best captain you could always like have on your team. He was the brother of whatever the Schultz guy's name is. I can't even remember. But the Schultz in St. Louis, he was his brother. Anyways, Barry Schultz won 2 Stanley Cups as a member of the Minnesota Wild, obviously. He had the game-winning goal against the Islanders, which got us our 2nd cup in 3 years. And then he also won 1 Selke trophy, which was in the later stages of his career. And it was also in between, actually, when his brother, Ronald Schultz, that's what his name was, won a bunch. So Ronald Schultz actually won like 6 or 7 Selke trophies. Barry Schultz only won 1. But Barry Schultz was a very good defensive player. Let's just go through his career numbers now. You guys will probably see this already on the screen, but anyways, he played 1,521 games, and he could have still technically played more because he never actually retired by the end of the GM mode series. He put up only 330 goals, so he was not much of a goal scorer, averaging around 22-23 a season, which is not too horrible. But then on assist-wise, he was averaging maybe around 30-40 a season. He had some seasons where he was below that, but he was just a really good point producer for the most part. By the end of his career, or by the end of the GM mode, he had just shy of 1,000 points with 979. And then he also was a type of player to get into a lot of fights and protect a team. So he put up 1,361 penalty minutes in 1,521 games, almost a penalty minute per game. And then he also was a plus 335. He was only a minus player once in his career, and that was in his rookie season where he was a minus 8. But every other season he was a plus player. Even in his last season when he was like an 80 overall, he was a plus 25. In terms of power play goals, he put up 64 power play goals. He also put up 11 short-handed goals. So this guy was basically a really good defensive player to have on your team, and just a really good solid piece to have to the team. So that's why he was the captain for so long. He was our 3rd overall pick way back in 2023, the year before we drafted Eric Fitzgerald. Next up we have Bruce Ruchin, and Bruce Ruchin was probably one of my favorite trade acquisitions we got in this GM mode. So we acquired him from the Dallas Stars alongside of Darcy Corson for Nicholas Whiting and Ryan Suter way back in the 2022-23 offseason, or the it would have been like the 2000, maybe it was 2020-21, I don't even know, but it was one of the off seasons. He played 1 year in our AHL affiliate before he came up. He started off a bit slow, putting up only like 20 points a season. However, he was always a plus player in his NHL career, so that was a big please to the team. He was a plus 256 by the end of it, which he retired in 2038-39 with 1,390 games played. So he played less than Bear Schultz, but he almost had the exact same plus minus, just like 100 less, I think. And then also, Bruce Ruchin put up 162 goals, 479 assists for 641 points. So he actually played pretty good offensively as well, and he won one Norris Trophy in his career, and that was the season I think where he put up 60 points back in 2028-29. Also, he won 2 Stanley Cups with us, as I said, and he was the 1st round pick, 16th overall in 2019 by the Dallas Stars. Also, Bruce, like Bear Schultz pretty much, he was a big fighter in the team. Like, I think he averaged like maybe 8 or 9 fights a season. He put up 1,285 penalty minutes in 1,390 games. So another guy that was really physical on the team, throwing the hits and getting into fights. So it was pretty cool to see another guy like that could also put up points and be solid defensively. Next up, we have the man Darcy Corson, my favorite goaltender in the series. So Darcy Corson won 1 Vezina trophy before his retirement, and that was with us. I forget what season it was, but he had one really good year with us. I think it was 2026-27. I'm not 100% sure with that, but he won the Vezina 1 year. He also won the Conn Smythe the year before we traded him to the New Jersey Devils, and then he won 2 Stanley Cups with us as well, and he didn't win any with the New Jersey Devils, surprisingly, because he had some really good seasons with New Jersey. But by the end of his career, he played 1,000 games, he won 508 games, lost 370 of them, and then lost in overtime 97 times. His goals against average was 2.37, and his save percentage was a .921. He actually was 8 shutouts away from getting 100 shutouts in his career, so he was a really good goaltender, even though there's people like that comment on my video, some guy that comments on my video, Duty Pie, I know who he actually is, but I'm not saying his actual name. He always said that Corson was never a good player to have on the team and that we already should get rid of him, but I only got rid of him the one time just because we needed to make more cap room because we had players like Kaprizov and stuff I wanted to get back. Corson was a guy that was making a lot of money, so that's why we let Corson go to the New Jersey Devils while we traded him away. And then we brought him back again in the 37-38 season to play like halfway through the year just so he could play the rest of his career with us, where he went 15-15-4, so he at least still got some wins then, and he reached 1,000 games played, so that was nice to see. Unfortunately, in the 38-39 season, he was listed as a like an AHL fringe goaltender, or not an AHL fringe goaltender, like just a fringe starter, and he was a 79 overall. No team actually signed him that entire season, and then he would retire, so it sucked that we didn't decide to get him back, but okay, no worries whatsoever. But yeah, he was also one of the first picks in this draft back in 2018, as he went 14th overall to the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, the Columbus Blue Jackets never used him. I don't know how they traded him to Dallas, but they traded him to Dallas, so I guess so they could hold on to like Korpisalo or Bobrovsky. So they traded him away to the Dallas Stars. Eventually, Dallas traded him to us, a part of that big deal that I was saying. And yeah, basically that's where he played most of his career until we traded him to New Jersey. We got back like Hellenis and some other people. So yeah, that's Darcy Corson. Next up, we have Eric Fitzgerald, and Eric Fitzgerald was another first round pick at 3rd overall that we had back in 2024, so the year after Bear Schultz. He was a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, and he never won any other awards, surprisingly, but he was a really good player later in his career. Like, he started off kind of slow, putting up 22 points one season and then 16 points, but eventually he found his offensive touch in the 2029-30 season, where he put up 61 points, and in every other season after that he put up around 70 points on average. So he was a very good player on that team. Like, he was listed as a sniper, but he was more of a playmaker because he only had 406 goals, but still he was a very good goal scorer when he needed to be, and a big piece to the team for quite a few years. By the end of his career, he played 1,469 games played. Like, he never actually retired at the end, just like Bear Schultz, but he played 1,469 games played. He had 406 goals, 670 assists for 1,076 points. So he was only the second player, I think, in this franchise mode to reach 1,000 points on our team. He was also a plus 222, so like in later stages of his career, he got a lot of pluses because he started off his career as a minus 24 after 2 years. He also had 556 penalty minutes, so he was a bit physical, or he got a lot of slashing penalties, that sort of thing. He put up 94 power play goals, did not have a single shorthanded goal, and his shooting percentage was pretty good at a 10.8. Next up, we have Jared Malone, and Jared Malone was our first round pick, or one of our first round picks in the 2023 draft. He went 27th overall to us. His potential is like a medium top 6, but he never really became that top 6 guy. We more used him as like a third or fourth line center, and he won 2 Stanley Cups with us, which was pretty nice. He was a bit of an underrated forward to an extent because he played 408 games and put up 71 goals, 61 assists for 132 points in his career with us only. And then eventually we let him go after the 32-33 season. I don't know where he signed. I saw it the last season. It said that he was with Philadelphia, but I don't know if all his stats were with Philadelphia or what. But he played an additional 86 games, putting up 32 points. So he basically retired with 164 points in just under 500 games. Next up, we have Kent Hodges, and Kent Hodges was with us for almost 10 years before we traded him away to the Las Vegas Golden Knights because we had to make room for some other youngsters that were coming up. So Kent Hodges was a low elite when we drafted him, and he grew to like an 83, 84 and stayed around there. But he was a pretty solid defenseman for the most part, but he was not very good defensively. Like, he was a minus most of his career. In his entire career, by the time he retired, he was a minus 30, but he had 210 points in 1,214 games, so it's not that bad considering he was like a third round pick of ours back in 2019. He also assisted on both Stanley Cup winning goals, including the one by Kirill Kaprizov in the last minute. He's the one that took the slap shot, I think, and it was deflected in front by Kaprizov. And he's also the one that took the slap shot, I think it was in the overtime against the Islanders, where it bounced off of Bear Schultz and in. So Kent Hodges will go down in history as a good piece to the team as well. Probably one of my favorite draft picks that I've done in this series. So yeah, as I was saying, he put up 77 goals, 133 assists for 210 points in 1,214 games. He would spend the last year of his career in the minors for Vegas in 2038-39, and that's when he retired. But when he was with Vegas, he was actually he didn't put up much points. And then his last season with them, he was just horribly defensively. Like, he was a minus 41. So, like, his defensive stats were probably diminishing and all that stuff. So, that's probably why he played so bad later in his career. But yeah, that is Kent Hodges. Next up, we got the legend, the best player probably in this GM mode, and that is Kirill Kaprizov, who was a created player of mine. I made him a high top 6, and he turned out to be a stud. He came into the NHL in the 2018-19 season, where he put up 44 points in 82 games. He would play all the way to the 37-38 season, so almost 20 years in the NHL. And yeah, he would not slow down his offense at all. His least amount of goals he had in a season was 14 goals, and that was the season where he had his injury problems in the second year in the NHL. In 2019-20. By the time he would retire in 37-38, he had 1,594 games played, 626 goals, 558 assists for 1,184 points. He was also a plus 174. He had 215 penalty minutes, 154 power play goals, so he was a really good power play specialist, and 1 shorthanded goal. His shooting percentage was also almost 11%, which is pretty ridiculous. But yeah, he was a very good player for us. He won the Conn Smythe the year we won the cup the first time around because he got a hat trick in Game 6 that won us the cup, including the game-winning goal, which I talked about earlier. where he scored with 3.2 seconds left or something like that on the clock to win us the cup. Also, he won the Lady Byng later in his career, where he was a plus 35. I think it was that season in 2000 and what season is that? 2034-35. I think that's where he won the Lady Byng. And then he also won 2 Stanley Cups with us. And in real life, he was drafted in 2015 in the 5th round at 135th overall. So yeah, this guy was just a beast for us. He never actually was the captain of the club. He was never even an alternate captain. But he was just one of those pieces that stuck around with us for a very long time. And I'm glad I kept him around because he consistently put up really big totals and goals. Like, his best season was a 46 goal season back in 24-25, but he also had a couple other 40 goal seasons, plenty of 30 goal seasons, and a couple 20 something goal seasons. Like, his last season, he didn't even slow down, putting up 33 points in 82 games at age 41. So very big piece to the club. In terms of his playoff stats, he was also a beast in playoffs. I didn't actually keep track of a lot of players for the playoffs, but Kirill Kaprizov was one of them. He had 117 points in 150 playoff games, and his shooting percentage surprisingly was even better in the playoffs than it was during the regular season. It was almost a 12% shooting percentage. He had 14 power play goals, 1 shorthanded goal. He was a plus 24, and yeah, pretty much just what you needed. Like, he was the exact same type of thing as he would be during the regular season. So his game transpired in both types of the season. Next up, we got Larry Suray. So Larry Suray was our 30th overall pick of the year, basically where we got eliminated in the finals to the Toronto Maple Leafs. We drafted Larry Suray, who was a low elite center at 30th overall. And Larry Suray, he only really grew to like an 84, and he was like a second line center for most of his career. He never really put up much points. Like, he was a consistent 40-point man usually, and he was solid defensively. Like, he wasn't the greatest, but he was solid. More of a defensively minded player than an offensively minded, more of a passer than a shooter. Eventually, we would let him go though in the 2033 offseason, and he would sign with the Nashville Predators. His only season with Nashville, he would put up 44 points in 82 games. And eventually he would be traded back to us for a 1st and a 3rd round pick. He would put up 42 points in his only season back with us before we would flip him again to the Colorado Avalanche for a prospect and a 3rd round pick. He would play pretty solidly with Colorado, but his point production would drop by the end of it. Including his last season with Colorado, he only put up 7 points in 32 games. Eventually, he would be traded to the Detroit Red Wings for his final season, where he put up 17 points in 82 games, and then he would retire eventually too. When he retired, he put up 568 points in 1,258 games, including 188 goals, 380 assists. He had 205 penalty minutes as well. He was a plus 62. He had 34 power play goals, 1 shorthanded goal, and a 9.56 save goals against or shooting percentage. Holy crap, there's too much stats to look. But yeah, Larry Suray was one of these pieces that I really liked having on the team. He's a great leader, probably. Like, he could have been honestly a captain if Bear Schultz wasn't just like one of those guys that was with us for a long part of the GM mode. Next up, we got Luke Kunin, who was another player I actually had to make. He was with us he was with us in the 2018-19 season. Like, he came into the league at the same time as Kirill Kaprizov, and he actually had a pretty good regular season for his first year. He played better than Kaprizov, putting up 52 points in 82 games, and eventually he was actually ahead of Kaprizov in points, but it was just because of Kaprizov's injury. Eventually, Luke Kunin would suffer an injury in 21-22 that would set him back a bit in the points, and by the time he left us after 10 years, he had 528 points in 790 games. And then we would trade him to the San Jose Sharks at the 2028 draft, where we would acquire Phil Paz. He would put up 41 points in only 82 games played in his only season with the San Jose Sharks. Eventually, he would sign as a free agent in the 2029 offseason with the Carolina Hurricanes, where he spent 3 seasons, where he played his best hockey, putting up 64 points, 67 points, and 65 points respectively. Eventually, he would be traded or signed to the Buffalo Sabres. I don't know which when he was, but he would retire in the 2032-33 season at only age 35, putting up 796 points in his 1,173 games in his career. He had more assists and goals by almost 100. He was a minus player in his career too. He was a -2, and he never won a single Stanley Cup or a single trophy, but he was definitely a really underrated player. I'm surprised he never actually got a chance at a cup, but Carolina, when he was there, were like kind of in a rebuilding stage, it seemed like, and San Jose was just really like near the bottom of the league for the most part during GM mode, and Buffalo was, I think he just decided to retire young. I don't know why he did, but that's what happened. Next up, we got our backup goaltender from many years, and that is Manny McQuaid. So Manny McQuaid was a 3rd round pick of us at 69th overall in 2024. He was the backup goalie for 2 Stanley Cup wins. His first ever season in the NHL was the most insane thing I've ever seen, as he played 15 games as backup, but he went 13-0-0 with a 1.54 goals against average and a .948 save percentage. Unfortunately, he never really got to play that good again, at least with us. And then he would leave the team in the 2036 offseason and sign with the Calgary Flames. The reason being is because he grew to an 89 and was expecting like 7 years at like $9 million, which is way too much for the team to afford at that point in time. When he was playing with Calgary, he had a couple great seasons to start off with them, but then eventually his game would like drop off considerably, and he would spend the last year of the GM mode with the Carolina Hurricanes. I don't think he was going to retire, but you never know. In his final season with, like in the GM mode with the Carolina Hurricanes, he went 16-37-6 with a 3.29 goals against average and an 894 save percentage. So it didn't end well for Manny McQuaid, but he did end up reaching 300 wins in only 598 games played. So he could have been up there in wins for sure. His goals against average in his career was only like up to a 2.6, so he was not the greatest for keeping pucks out of the net, just getting the win. And he also had a .911 save percentage and 45 shutouts. Next up, we got Marshall Tillett, and Marshall Tillett we acquired from the Buffalo Sabres when we traded away Samuel Salo. Obviously, that trade did not work out in our favor because Samuel Salo became a high elite and grew to like a 91. But anyways, Marshall Tillett we kept for 4 years on our team. He was trending upwards as he put up 8 points in his first season, then 12, then 12, then 19. But just we needed to make room again for youngsters, so we traded him to the Colorado Avalanche with a 6th round pick for a 1st round pick from the Boston Bruins. Also, we traded him because he was like really, like his morale was going down a lot. Like he was just getting pissed off at his play recently, and it just didn't transpire to good things on the ice, so we flipped him. And with Colorado, he was actually averaging around 40 points a season, which is pretty good. Not scoring a lot of goals, but picking up a lot of assists and picking up a lot of penalty minutes. Eventually, he would be traded to Arizona, where he would spend 3 seasons and also do around the same, put around 40 points up. And then he signed or was traded to the Washington Capitals for the final season of the GM mode, where he put up 20 points in 82 games. So he's kind of trending downwards. Probably was going to retire in a couple of years. You never know. But by the end of the GM mode, he played 998 career games, putting up 55 goals, 309 assists for 364 points. He was not the greatest defensive player. He was a plus 54, and he put up 584 penalty minutes, so he was one of those guys that were in the box a lot. Next up, we got Matt Dumba, who was with us for most of this GM mode. You guys would have seen him play out his entire career, I'm pretty sure. So Matt Dumba was the 7th overall pick back in 2012. He won 2 Stanley Cups with us, and he was a pretty good, he picked up a lot of points in some years. I don't remember if he won any awards with us. I don't think he did because I didn't list it. But yeah, he had a couple really good years. Like he put up 69 points one season when he was like an 88 overall. Put up 61 points, 64 points one year. So a consistent good player. He was also a plus 219 because he spent a lot of his career playing with Bruce Ruchin. But he also had 958 penalty minutes, so another guy that was in the box a lot of his career. He had 43 power play goals, 4 shorthanded goals, and a 5.54 shooting percentage. So he didn't score that often, but he averaged maybe around 10 goals a season sometimes, maybe a bit less than that. Next up, we got Mikael Granlund, who you guys would have seen all his career as well. He won 2 Stanley Cups with us. One time he was actually in the minors, but since he played 50-something games, he's still considered a champion from that team. So he won 2 Stanley Cups with us. He was the 9th overall pick back in 2010. I have his actual career stats listed on here as well, from 12-13 all the way up to 16-17. And then as you can see, he didn't really miss that much games in his career with us, except for like the later years, or the later year. He would retire with 1,428 games played in the NHL, only 201 goals, so he was not really that much of a goal scorer, but definitely he was a really good playmaker, putting up 631 assists for 832 points. He was only a plus 56, so not a really good defensive guy, and then he had 261 penalty minutes, 49 power play goals, 4 shorthanded goals, and an 8.37 shooting percentage. So I guess he just didn't shoot the puck enough. Like if he would have shot it more, maybe he could have picked up more goals, but he was more of a playmaker in the series. Next up, we got Philip Haas, and Philip Haas was the 6th overall pick back in 2022 by the San Jose Sharks. We acquired him for Luke Kunin. Basically, with the San Jose Sharks, he was playing pretty solid hockey, putting up around 40-something points. But when he came to us, he didn't play as good. He was averaging like 30-40 points, so less than what he did in San Jose. He got probably a little bit more less ice time, but he was more of a good defensive player because he was a minus player every time he played with the Sharks. But when he was playing with us, he was a plus for most of it until the later stages before we released him in 35-36. He would sign with the Philadelphia Flyers, and he had one really good season with them where he put up 53 points. Actually, one of the seasons I watched, I think one of the games where we played against the Philadelphia Flyers, and he actually had a goal against us, so it was kind of funny to see that. Eventually, in the last 2 seasons, before he would retire, I think it was, or last 2 seasons before the GM mode ended, he would play with the Pittsburgh Penguins. One year he only played 60 games, and then the year afterwards, I think he was used as a depth guy because he only played 4 games. And then the last season of the GM mode, he was in the AHL playing for the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins. So he was just down there chilling, putting up points as a 36-year-old, I think it was. But he was a decent player for the most part, as he retired pretty much with 631 points in 1,292 games played. Next up, we got Roman Baran, and Roman Baran was another first-round pick of ours at 24th overall in 2023, so the same year as Jared Malone. He would retire as a 2-time Stanley Cup champion and used more as a 4th-liner / depth guy with us. He only spent 3 years in the NHL before he was basically a free agent for the rest of it because nobody signed him at all. But he would basically retire with 35 points in 164 games. So he wasn't the greatest player, but he wasn't that bad either. He was a bit of a bust for a first-round pick, but I'll take him. He was not that bad at all. I just don't know why any teams didn't sign him for his 4th line, because he was solid defensively for the most part, as he was a +6 by the end of his career. Okay, so now let's get on to a couple of the busts in the series that we had. So we had quite a few first-round busts in this GM mode. One of them was George Lemaire, which I didn't actually put down his stats because I don't think he even really played in NHL with us. So anyways, I didn't give a shit about him. But Gene Seabrook. Now, Gene Seabrook was our 11th overall pick back in 2022, and he didn't really do much in the NHL. He played 324 games, putting up 8 goals, 10 assists for 18 points. He actually won the Stanley Cup with us in 2028-29. He played the first round, and then we scratched him and used him as a depth guy. And then the St. Louis Blues, he actually won the Stanley Cup with in the 2033-34 season, and then he would retire in 2037-38. Next up, we have Isaac Lundestrom, and Isaac Lundestrom was probably one of the biggest offensive busts we had in this series. He was a 10th overall pick of ours back in the first year of the draft. He was like a medium top 9 forward, didn't turn out to be anything at all. He played 263 games in the NHL, putting up 18 goals, 43 assists for only 61 points. And he never really grew to being above a 78, I think. So yeah, he was just not really good of a player, but big bust in this franchise mode. Now on to the most notable bust that we've ever had, and that was Nicholas Whiting. Now Nicholas Whiting, like I said, we traded him away to the Dallas Stars because he had a lot of trade value still. And we also traded away Ryan Suter, who had a lot of trade value. We managed to pick back Darcy Corson, who had a pretty big load of trade value. He was like a 79, so he was going to be our backup for the season after this trade happened. And Bruce Ruchin was getting closer to being NHL ready, but he was going to be in the AHL next season. I didn't think Ruchin was going to be as good as he was, but like, yeah, that trade basically was one that set our course for our rest of our GM mode. So yeah, Nicholas Whiting, we drafted him at 22nd overall. He was a medium elite goaltender, but the thing is, he was not growing really fastly. Like, he was a 50 overall out of the draft, and then I think the highest he ever was in the NHL was like an 80. So by the end of his career, he only played 78 games, and he only put up 27 wins, 36 losses, 5 overtime/shootout losses, and he averaged about 3.14 goals against per game. As well, he had a 900 save percentage and only 1 shutout, so he was a big bust. And yeah, so not the greatest player for a 22nd overall pick, especially when he has medium elite potential. Okay, so now let's get onto the players that were in the later years that you guys would not have necessarily seen. So starting off, we have Bobby McCormick. So Bobby McCormick we drafted in the first round at 19th overall, the year after you guys would have stopped watching. So basically, Bobby McCormick was pretty solid in both ends of the ice. Like, when I watched him, he seemed to be pretty solid. He was a very physical player for the most part. He was not really that consistent in terms of his production wise, because he was an 89 overall and listed as a second liner. He had a couple good seasons where he put up 58 points, but after that his point totals went down a lot, and he stayed on the same line, which was weird. So I don't know what happened, but he would only put up 48 points the year after he put up 58 points, then go back up to 50, but then he dropped considerably to 37 points. So I don't know what was with his game, but he put up 324 points in 653 games by the end of the GM mode. He was also at plus 97, so that's why he was a good player in both ends of the ice. And he also put up not much penalty minutes, but he was a very good physical player. I think he was actually a power forward, if I remember correctly. Next up, we got Edwin Fallon. Now, Edwin Fallon, it kind of sucked because he only played 1 season with us, because that was the last year of the GM mode. He was drafted in 2040 at 6th overall. Now, we got the 6th overall pick from St. Louis because we made a big trade where we traded away Harvey Pittis, who was another former goaltender of ours. And we also traded away one of our a medium elite goaltending prospects, because we had a couple at the time. And we traded those both to St. Louis in exchange for Patrick Blake, who became our medium elite starter goaltender at an 87 or so at age 23. And then we also got back a first round draft pick for the upcoming draft. Now, that first round pick ended up being almost a lot, well, it was a lottery pick, and we managed to pick Edwin Fallon, who was a medium elite at 6th overall. And then Edwin Fallon would put up 52 points in 78 games in his only NHL season. So this guy was going to be the future piece for this team. I was interested to see how he would play out, but unfortunately you can't go past the 41-42 season. Next up, we got Yanni Natanen. So Yanni Natanen came into the NHL as an 81 overall, but he tore it up in the 2039-40 season. Like, in the later years, he was a very good player, as he put up 82 points in 39-40. So he was a point per game that year. The year after that as well, he put up 71 points, so he continued to play well, but then he was starting to drop after that, but he was still averaging around 50 something points a season. So he was a very good piece for this team. I think the highest overall I've seen him at was like an 87 or an 88. He had 492 points in 732 games before the end of the GM mode, and he also was the type of player to take a decent amount of penalty minutes. Like, he was kind of undisciplined, as he would put up 393 penalty minutes in 732 games. Next up, we got Jason Roenick. Now, you guys would have seen me draft Jason Roenick, I think. He was drafted in 2032 at the 6th round spot at 180th overall. Probably one of the best 6th round picks I've ever had, other than in my offline GM mode. He put up 329 points in 656 games, and he was kind of a bad player to an extent, because when I was watching some of the games, he was taking like penalties in the late stages of the game, which cost us a couple of series. So he wasn't like, he put up the points, like 50 something points in his later years, but his penalty minutes were at the worst opportune times. Like, during the regular season, he only had 80 penalty minutes in 656 games. but like in the playoffs he was just taking some stupid penalties at stupid times. Next up we got Jordan Levali. So you guys would have seen this guy play for I think 1 season. He was drafted in the 3rd round at 93rd overall in the 2029 draft. He was a very good underrated piece. He was a low elite defenseman. I think he grew to like an 86, 85. But yeah, he basically put up 477 points in 900 games. Majority of them were assists. So this guy was technically like what Liljegren did in our Canucks series, if you guys ever watched that series. If not, I will put like a card up so you guys could check that out. But yeah, so yeah, Levali was basically like Liljegren 2.0, just putting up a lot more assists than goals, and that's why his shooting percentage was not that good. But yeah, Levali was dropping off probably by around this stage. Like I think he was around 30 years old by the end of this GM mode, so he could have played probably another couple seasons, but he was probably getting closer to his retirement age. Next up we got Pascal Huet, who was drafted in the 2nd round in 2032 at 56 overall. Now he was also one of these players that were really kind of inconsistent to an extent, because he had like a couple of really good seasons. Like his 2nd NHL season he had 59 points. Could have been just because he was on the power play, but the years where he was not on the power play, he'd only put up like 20 or 30 points a season, but he was still a respectable player for the most part. He also took kind of stupid penalties in the playoffs when I was watching. You could kind of tell with the mustache, he looked like an enforcer more than a goal scorer. But yeah, he had 365 points in 820 games, so it was not too bad. He almost had as much goals as he did assists, as well as he had 161 goals, 204 assists. Next up we got Pascal Pouliot, who when we drafted him at 19th overall in 2034, he was listed as a medium elite, but he never reached that, so he only was like basically a medium top 6 in his career, but he was solid for the most part, putting up 110 points in 244 games. Not a really good defensive player. He was only a plus 13 by the end of it, but he was probably going to trend in the right direction, as he was like an 86 I think in the last year of the GM mode. So yeah, that is Pascal Pouliot. We could say that he was the son of Benoit Pouliot, who was also a Minnesota Wild draft pick. Next up we got Patrick Blake, who was the goaltender I mentioned that we got from the St. Louis Blues. Patrick Blake was a very good goaltender. The year the St. Louis Blues won the Stanley Cup, I think it was, he was the 31st overall pick in the 1st round in 2035, so a really good late round steal. He was medium elite. Basically his first season in the NHL, which was the 38-39 season, he spent as the backup for the St. Louis Blues, where he went 7-4-3 in his first 18 NHL games, putting up a 1.87 goals against average, a 939 save percentage, and 1 shutout. So when I saw that, when I was looking at the trading block, I saw that and I was like, you know, this guy could be really, really good. So I pulled the trigger on a deal for him. And in his first ever season with us, he put up played 71 games, won 38, 25, and 6 with a 2.16 goals against average and a 926 save percentage, as well as 7 shutouts. So I knew this guy was definitely ready for the NHL. The next couple seasons as well, he was just trending upwards. Like he was a very, very good goaltender. 2040-41, he played 69 games and he won 40, 22, and 6 with a less than 2 goals against average, a 1.99 to be exact. He also had a 933 save percentage and 10 shutouts. And in the last year of the GM mode, he played 70 games, went 38, 25, and 5 with a 1.98. So he even beat his previous year's totals in goals against average, and he had a 932 save percentage with 10 shutouts. So basically by the end of his career so far, he played just over 200 games. He had almost 125 wins. He had a 2 goals against average and a 932 save percentage on average, as well as 28 shutouts. So this guy was probably going to be a bomb of a player. We could say that he was the son of Patrick Waugh and Rob Blake. If like Patrick Waugh and Rob Blake had a baby, he could have been the one, because like look at his mask, it kind of reminds me of Patrick Waugh's to an extent. He was just like a really, really good goaltender though. Okay, so that's going to do it guys for our finale recap of our Minnesota Wild GM mode. So that's going to wrap it up for the entire series. So hopefully you guys really like this idea. If there's any like things that I did not explain in this video that you guys want to know, let me know down below in the comments, or you could Facebook message me or DM me on Twitter, and I'll be happy to look up a couple things for you, because I'll probably keep the save file or something on my Xbox so I could like look back at it and tell you guys certain things. But yeah, so hopefully you guys really like this series. The next GM mode series probably has already started by the time this video is out. If it hasn't, you guys should go check it out when it does. But yeah, thank you guys so much for being here throughout this entire GM mode. It's been a blast doing it, and there's been a lot of like players that I really like that were on this team. Like it was not as good and as successful as their Canucks GM mode, where we won like 5 Stanley Cups. However, the team itself in Minnesota was really good because we had a very good captain in Bear Schultz. We had some really good players like snipers, at least in Kirill Kaprizov, Eric Fitzgerald over the years. We had a couple of really good defensemen like Dumba and Bruce Ruchin. We had a couple of good goaltenders like Darcy Corson and all that stuff. So it was a decent series for the most part, I think. Let me know what you guys think of the series down below as well. That would mean a lot. So anyways, guys, that's going to wrap it up. So thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys next time.